Welcome to Green Peak Alliance for Your Health. I'm Elizabeth Kelsey, and I'm here today with Katrin Tchana, a licensed clinical social worker who's at Manascutney Hospital as a family wellness therapist. Today we're going to talk about trauma and how we can approach substance misuse by looking at trauma. So welcome, Katrin.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
So can you tell us, what do we mean by trauma, and how do we know trauma negatively impacts youth development?
So when we talk about trauma, I think trauma means any kind of impact or anything that happens to a person that is damaging. So you can talk about traumatic brain injury, and that's when your head is hit really hard by something so that your brain becomes injured. Mm-hmm. So we can talk about physical trauma, and we can also talk about psychological trauma. So psychological trauma would be any kind of experience that does damage to your psyche or to your emotional well-being. And that was the first part of your question. What was the second part?
That how does it negatively potentially impact youth development? The psychological trauma.
Yeah, so psychological trauma can negatively impact youth development by causing, impeding the way that children develop. So when a child is traumatized, it sends hormones to the brain that prevent them from, that can prevent them from paying attention well. So it could negatively impact a child going to school, or in paying attention in school, or learning the other things that kids naturally need to learn. Though it can impact a child's ability to have good, healthy relationships with others, to form strong attachments with caretakers and other people in the child's life. And trauma can cause ongoing anxiety or depression. And it can also cause difficulty with sort of staying present and managing your emotions. When by staying present, I mean being able to really pay attention to what's going on in the room, what's going on around you. So those are some of the ways that trauma can impact a child's development. We know about that because there have been studies for many years. They've done studies of children who have experienced trauma and have found that, in fact, it does impact how your brain develops.
And what are some cases you've seen how it can develop in which someone would have those experiences and then turn to substances, drugs, and alcohol? What does that particular situation look like, and how does that unravel?
So having a trauma in childhood, so experiencing trauma in childhood can make a person more vulnerable to developing a substance use disorder. And that's because, well, there are very often, though, whatever was traumatic is not necessarily resolved at the time that the child reaches an age where children normally start experimenting with substances, which can really be as young as, sometimes 10 years old. And when a child does start experimenting with substances, they may find that that they really like the way it makes them feel because it calms their anxiety, or helps them forget about the traumatic event. And so they're more likely to really want to repeat that experience and become more interested in using substances. Children who are exposed to trauma also are more vulnerable to entering into relationships that aren't necessarily healthy and being in exploitative relationships, and so those relationships may lead them to use substances as a way to cope or as a way to keep up.
And so we're talking about people who start to use substances not long after trauma occurred, young people, but then does it also happen that people in their adulthood, people who've had these adverse childhood experiences, they're also more likely to later on?
That can happen.
Yeah.
We really have come to understand that substance use disorders are pediatric diseases.
Mm.
So most people who develop substance use disorders will develop them will start using substances when they are children, or very young. So, by the time 12, 13, 14, in that age range. That doesn't mean that an adult can't develop a substance use disorder. And it doesn't mean that trauma can't impact an adult and then lead to substance use.
Mm-hmm.
So an adult might have a car accident and be really traumatized by that experience and find herself going home at night and drinking to forget the experience, and then find that over time she's developed a problem with drinking too much.
Yeah.
And so, and therefore, needs to get help with dealing with her substance use as well as with her trauma.
Yeah.
But it's adults who, when a person begins using substances as an adult, she's more likely to be able to manage the substance appropriately, and also is more likely to be able to stop if she finds that things are getting out of control.
Mm-hmm.
Because she's had the experience of not using substances over time. She knows what that feels like.
Right.
So it's, that's why it's really important to screen for substance use in childhood and in the early teen years, because that's really when people are most vulnerable to it.
Mm-hmm. And why are some children resilient despite being exposed to trauma? And what are some things in their lives that help contribute to that resiliency?
So let me see if I get your question. So why are some children more resilient than others to
basically.
trauma?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think we're all individuals, and things impact us in different ways. Because you've experienced trauma as a child does not mean that you will necessarily develop a substance use disorder. And people develop substance use disorders without ever having experienced trauma. Mm-hmm. So both of those things can happen. And some people are more resilient to trauma just biologically. Their neurological system is such that they're less sensitive to noise, perhaps, or they're less sensitive to other people, to their own experience of emotions. And they're just, that there are those kids that are like easygoing, mm-hmm. right? And then there are other kids who are more sensitive or more intense. So we all have different abilities to manage our environment. And so children who are more sensitive to the environment will tend to have a stronger reaction if something bad happens, or may find something that another kid might find unpleasant but not traumatic, might be traumatic for that kind of child.
Yeah.
Other things that create resilience are strong relationships. Strong relationships with a caretaker is very resilient, even if, and strong relationships with someone in the community. So a grandparent, a teacher, a community member, a preschool teacher, a church leader. There's all of those positive relationships that we get from being in community protect us from the negative impacts of trauma. Mm. I can go on. Do you want me to tell you more?
Yeah, tell me more.
We've also found that exercise is very protective for a lot of different things, a lot of emotional health problems. Mm-hmm. So kids who get a lot of exercise and are physically healthy, kids who play on teams that's a good resilience creator for somebody who's experienced trauma. So those positive experiences and a healthy body will counteract some of the negative impact of the trauma. Mm. Other things that create resilience are music. There's been a number of studies that show that music actually changes the way that the brain develops in a way that allows for a much greater resilience to difficult experiences. Not listening to music, but actually playing music. So learning to play an instrument or singing in a choir, making music, playing drums, making any kind of music is both healing for people who have experienced, for young people who have experienced trauma and older people, and it also creates resilience. Nature creates resilience and positive connections with animals. So a lot of times, you might have a kid who was severely neglected and experienced a lot of abuse, but they can tell you, but I have this tree that I always go to, and the tree is like my mother. Or the tree, just like I feel safe when I sit in the tree. Or my dog is everything to me. So the positive connections with animals and nature can also really create a strong resilience.
Great. What can we do to build assets in every child?
So to build resilience in our communities and for all kids.
Yeah.
I think some of the things I just said lead to that. So I think having a strong community, having a community where every child has a number of connections. We tend to be too isolated in this society.
Yeah.
So kids are isolated in their homes with just their usually often stressed out parents, and if something bad's going on in that home, they might not have a lot of connection with other adults that can ameliorate that. And but the more connections that a child has, and the more opportunities parents have for making connections with other people in the community, then the more resilient we will be, and the stronger we'll be able, the better our ability to absorb difficult experiences. And I think also that we can all work together to really fight against poverty. Poverty is a kind of stressor that in itself can really lead to traumatic events. You can test that out yourself. All you have to do is think about a money worry right now, and then have somebody ask you for something, and see how long of a fuse you've got.
Yeah.
Imagine having to constantly worry about where's the next meal coming from, how are we going to pay rent, how are we going to get a roof over our heads, and then having one kid or a number of kids all demanding, because kids ask for things, right? All demanding something at the same time. And you can get a sense of how stressful it can be to be a parent in poverty. So the more that we can support programs that ameliorate poverty and advocate for good paying jobs, I think that the stronger our communities will be.
And some examples of those programs, I think of free community lunch programs, things like that, to help people out, just give them a helping hand. And also organizations such as mentorships, the mentor organizations where people can volunteer.
That's a wonderful thing, and I've seen that make a huge, like the Windsor Family Partnership, is that it?
Yeah.
That's a wonderful, and that's made like huge, a huge difference in the lives of so many kids and families, and I'd love to see that expanded. I think we never have enough mentors, so yeah, that's a great example. I'd love to see the free lunches be available to everybody, rather than it being something that you have to be a child, you have to be, you've got to be under a certain income level. Very often people with a middle class income also struggle with food security.
Right. I'm seeing that more. I'm seeing that more, that they're available to everybody, no questions asked and that kind of thing. So it's good. Can you talk about ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, and why schools are incorporating ACEs training?
So adverse child experiences are a term that refers to difficult events in childhood. And there's a questionnaire that's been developed to screen for whether or not a person has had a number of adverse childhood experiences. And there are 10 items on that questionnaire. Items range from, were you ever inappropriately touched by an adult when you were a child? Was anybody in your family, did anybody in your family have a problem with drugs and alcohol? Was anyone in your family ever arrested? Or were you ever called bad names when you were a child? So there's a range of them that I can't remember all 10. So they've used this screening and done a number of studies that show that, when we ask adults about adverse child experiences, it gives us some insight into the fact that adults who experience adverse childhood events really continue to struggle as adults. And, we talked about trauma and some of the impact of trauma, and attentional problems. Trauma can cause attentional problems. So it can be difficult for a person who's experienced a traumatic event to pay attention, especially when their stress level is up. So in hospitals, we've started to screen, sometimes, for example, in primary care facilities or in obstetric clinics, we've started to screen for adverse childhood experiences, because it gives us insight into the fact that a person may have some unresolved trauma that really might impact their ability to absorb a new experience, and have their all their wits about them. So if I've had if something happens, I go into labor, and having a pain in my pelvis really brings back the experience of being sexually abused as a child, then I can start to have flashbacks to that prior experience. I can start to dissociate, so I'm not really present in the moment. It's hard for me to pay attention. Mm-hmm. It's hard for me to know what's going on. So knowing in advance that, I've had some difficult experiences as a child, maybe I should do some therapy around that, or just be prepared for the fact that whatever this new experience coming up might trigger some of that. It helps me feel more in control, and it would help me be more prepared. Mm. And it also helps providers know that, this person might need a little extra help, right? Yeah. I think in schools it's the same thing. Yeah. In schools we need to, knowing that a child might have experienced some adverse events means that the teacher can be more sensitive to the fact that the child might have difficulty absorbing new information. Yeah. So I'm guessing that that's why they're using it in schools. Yeah.
This is a broad question. I don't know if there's really an answer to it, but what can we do as individuals and society to prevent these traumas from occurring? Does it help to encourage children to be open to safe adults? And what can adults who work with children be aware of to mitigate the effects of traumatic experiences, or just to be aware of dangers or anything?
Well, we talked earlier about some of the social programs that we can put in place that really do create a safer environment for all children. So, reducing poverty creates a safer environment for all children. Having more adults in your life is always a good thing. I think the idea of it takes a village is really true. Yeah. So the more that we can reach out to young families and offer support to young families. It's always difficult to be a young parent. It's always difficult to have little children. So the more support they can get from neighbors, teachers, doctors, community members, then the better off everyone's going to be. I think we can also be aware that what might look like inappropriate behavior might be actually a response to trauma. Sometimes, a key problem with experiencing a traumatic event is it makes it more difficult to manage your emotional responses to things. So you may see a child having a very big response that seems quite inappropriate. Suddenly a child's having a temper tantrum, or it's normal for young children to have temper tantrums, but a child you wouldn't expect to be having a temper tantrum, who's maybe 8 years old, and or acting out in an angry way, I think we can be less judgmental about what's happening and understand that in fact that may be in response to some of the experiences that child has had very often, I don't think most people want to behave badly, but not everybody really feels capable of behaving well.
Yeah.
So the less judgmental and the less we stigmatize people for their behavior and the more understanding we can all be, I think that's a positive thing.
A way to start, to at least be kind. You can start by being kind.
Yes, that's something we can all do, no matter and it really doesn't cost anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in terms of healing, how can people who have experienced trauma and who are struggling with substance misuse heal from their trauma, and how can others in their lives support them through this healing process?
Well, I think the most important thing to know is that it is absolutely possible to heal from trauma, and it's also possible to heal from substance misuse. That's something that I've seen happen over and over again throughout my career, and so nobody should feel like I'm damaged beyond repair, or, because of things that have happened to me, I'll never be quote unquote normal. In fact, everyone, so experiencing difficult, adverse events also causes a person's character to grow. So it's not that we want people to experience pain and suffering, but in fact that is part of the human experience. How do you heal from it? I think that when people have substance abuse and trauma at the same time, it can be a hard path, because you really have to stop using substances. But when you stop using substances, a lot of memories and a lot of the feelings that the substances have kind of numbed out start to reemerge. So it can feel almost intolerable to be sober. So help can come in the form of professional help, such as going to therapy or getting medication. Help can come from going to a peer support group, such as AA or NA or Al-Anon or Recover Together. Help can come in terms of developing a spiritual community, or sometimes help comes from really engaging with your creative self, and very often help means that you want to go in all of those directions, right? So that you want to seek out spiritual support, and you want to really develop yourself creatively, and you also want to do a little therapy, and you might want to talk to your doctor about medication too, as well as join a support group. So there definitely is, there are resources available for people who are struggling with trauma, and there are resources for people who are struggling with substance use. And there's no one who goes to a substance use to a facility, whether it's inpatient or outpatient, to a facility that's designed to treat substance misuse, that will not encounter people who really understand that trauma can often be at the bottom of that.
Yeah.
So treating trauma and treating substance use, they go hand in hand.
And in terms of the family and friends of the person who is struggling, does it just go back to that idea of kindness and understanding?
Well, I think it's important to be understanding, for sure, that that experiencing trauma and also having a substance use disorder can really lead to a lot of very bad behaviors. I always encourage anyone who's has a loved one who is struggling with a substance use disorder, or struggling with major depression, or struggling with a mental health disorder, to seek out their own support.
Right.
So there's the organization Al-Anon is designed for people who love people who have addiction, people who love people who struggle with addiction, or people who struggle with alcoholism. It's open to everyone, and that can be an excellent place of support. And very often you may feel, people who love people who have an addictive disorder, or people who love people with a mental health problem, may feel really overwhelmed, and they can also seek out their own support, because it's hard to know, what's helpful and what isn't so helpful.
Right.
It doesn't help to sacrifice your own life because the person that you love is not ready to get help.
Right.
Yeah. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, that answered
Okay.
this question and
Yeah.
all of my questions, really. Do you
Uh-huh.
have anything else you'd like to add?
No, I don't think so. Thank you for your great questions.
Thank you for your great responses. Thanks so much.
Yeah, nice to be here.
And we have some resources on these topics, both national and Vermont-based, to share with you.